The alley reeked of stale beer and forgotten dreams. David Walker huddled against the cold brick wall, his weathered hands clutching a tattered coat around his shoulders. He watched the world pass by, a silent observer of a life that had long since left him behind. A child's laughter pierced the air, drawing David's attention to the bustling street beyond his shadowy refuge. A little girl with braided hair and a bright yellow backpack skipped along the sidewalk, her mother's hand clasped tightly in hers. David's heart clenched. For a moment, he saw another little girl, another time, another life. He shook his head, dispelling the memory like smoke. A screech of tires shattered the morning calm. David's head snapped up, his eyes widening in horror. The little girl had broken free from her mother's grasp, darting into the street after a bouncing ball. A car barreled towards her, the driver's face a mask of panic. Without thought, David sprung into action. His legs, stiff from nights spent on cold concrete, carried him faster than he'd moved in years. He lunged forward, scooping the child into his arms and rolling across the asphalt as the car whizzed by, missing them by inches. For a moment, all was silent. Then, chaos erupted. "Emily!" The mother's scream cut through the air as she rushed towards them. David sat up, cradling the trembling girl in his arms. "You're okay, sweetheart," he murmured, his voice rough from disuse. "You're safe now." The girl looked up at him, her brown eyes wide with a mix of fear and wonder. "You saved me," she whispered. A crowd began to gather, their voices a cacophony of shock and speculation. "Is that the mayor's daughter? Who's that man holding her? He looks homeless. What's he doing here?" David felt the weight of their stares, the judgment in their eyes. He gently set the girl down as her mother approached, tears streaming down her face. "Emily, baby, are you all right?" The woman pulled her daughter close, her eyes never leaving David. "I'm okay, Mommy," Emily said. "This man saved me." The mother's gaze softened for a moment, gratitude warring with suspicion. "Thank you," she said hesitantly. David nodded, struggling to his feet. His body ached from the impact, but it was nothing compared to the pain of seeing the fear in the woman's eyes as she looked at him. A police siren wailed in the distance, growing louder by the second. "Step away from the child," a gruff voice commanded. David turned to see a police officer approaching, hand on his holster. The crowd parted like the Red Sea, leaving David exposed and vulnerable. "Officer, David began, but the words died in his throat as he recognized the man before him. Detective Marcus Reed's eyes widened in recognition. "David Walker," he breathed, disbelief etched across his face. David's heart raced. He hadn't heard his full name spoken aloud in years. "Marcus," he said quietly. "It's been a long time." The detective's hand fell away from his weapon, confusion replacing the stern authority in his eyes. "We thought you were dead," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Before David could respond, a sleek black car pulled up to the curb. The crowd's murmurs grew louder as Mayor Richard Thompson emerged, his tailored suit a stark contrast to David's ragged appearance. "What's going on here?" the mayor demanded, his eyes scanning the scene before landing on Emily. "Sweetheart, are you all right?" Emily nodded, still clinging to her mother. "That man saved me, Daddy," she said, pointing at David. Mayor Thompson's gaze snapped to David, recognition and something darker flashing in his eyes. "You," he hissed, his face contorting with a mix of shock and fury. David stood his ground, meeting the mayor's glare with quiet defiance. "Hello, Richard," he said calmly. "It's been a while." The mayor's composure cracked for a split second before he schooled his features into a mask of concern. "This man is dangerous," he announced to the crowd. "He's a criminal who's been in hiding for years. Detective Reed, arrest him immediately." Marcus hesitated, looking between David and the mayor. "Sir, I'm not sure, That's an order, Detective," Thompson snapped. David felt the familiar weight of handcuffs closing around his wrists. As Marcus led him towards a police car, David leaned in close. "Marcus," he whispered urgently, "check the old case files." The truth is there, hidden in plain sight. Marcus's grip on David's arm tightened, a silent acknowledgement passing between them. As David was about to be placed in the back of a squad car, a small voice rang out. "Wait." Emily broke free from her mother's grasp, running towards David with tears in her eyes. "Don't take him away," she pleaded. "He saved me. He's a hero." The crowd fell silent, all eyes on the little girl standing defiantly before the homeless man and the police officer. Mayor Thompson strode forward, his face a mask of forced calm. "Emily, sweetheart, come here. This man is dangerous. He's not who you think he is." Emily shook her head, her braids swinging. "No, Daddy, you're wrong." She looked up at David, her eyes wide with a child's certainty. "I know who he is." David's heart thundered in his chest. He looked down at Emily, seeing a ghost of his past reflected in her eyes. "He's my real daddy," Emily declared, her voice ringing out across the stunned crowd. "I saw his picture in Mommy's old album. She told me he went away, but I always knew he'd come back someday." The world seemed to tilt on its axis. David stared at Emily, his mind reeling. It couldn't be. And yet, he looked up to see Sarah, Emily's mother, pushing through the crowd. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with shock and recognition. "David," she whispered, her voice trembling. Mayor Thompson's face had gone ashen. "This is ridiculous," he sputtered. "Sarah, tell them this man is lying." But Sarah couldn't tear her eyes away from David. "It's really you," she breathed. "After all these years." The crowd erupted into chaos, voices rising in confusion and speculation. Detective Reed stood frozen, his hands still on David's arm, unsure of what to do. David felt the weight of years of injustice, of hardship and loss, pressing down on him. But as he looked at Emily's determined face, at Sarah's tearful recognition, he felt something else stirring within him. Hope. A chance to reclaim the life that had been stolen from him. "I'm not the man you think I am," David said, his voice carrying over the din of the crowd. He looked directly at Mayor Thompson, whose face had twisted into a mask of barely contained rage. "I think it's time the truth came out." As the words left his lips, David knew that nothing would ever be the same again. The carefully constructed lies were beginning to unravel, and he was at the center of it all. The homeless man, the forgotten father, the wronged citizen. He was all of these things and more. And now, finally, he had a chance to set things right. The cold metal of the handcuffs bit into David's wrists as Detective Reed led him away from the stunned crowd. Emily's tearful cries echoed in his ears, a bittersweet reminder of the life he'd lost. "You're making a mistake," David muttered, his eyes fixed on Mayor Thompson's ashen face. Reed's grip tightened. "Save it for the station, Walker." As they approached the squad car, Mayor Thompson's voice rang out, sharp and authoritative. "Detective Reed, a word." Reed hesitated, then guided David to lean against the car. "Don't move," he warned before stepping away. David watched as Thompson pulled Reed aside, their hushed conversation punctuated by Thompson's aggressive gestures. He strained to hear, catching fragments. "Dangerous criminal. Manipulating my daughter. Handle this quietly." Reed's posture stiffened, his jaw clenching. He nodded curtly and returned to David. "Let's go," Reed said, his voice tight. As David was pushed into the back seat, he caught a final glimpse of Emily. Her small face was streaked with tears, her mother holding her back as she reached out towards him. The sight twisted something deep in David's chest. The drive to the station was tense, filled with unspoken questions. David broke the silence. "You know I'm innocent, Marcus." Reed's eyes flicked to the rear-view mirror. "It's been years, David. A lot's changed." "Not everything," David countered. "The truth is still out there. You just need to look." Reed's knuckles whitened on the steering wheel. "And where exactly should I be looking?" David leaned forward, his voice low and urgent. "The old case files. There's more there than meets the eye." Thompson made sure of that. A flicker of doubt crossed Reed's face, but but he remained silent for the rest of the drive. At the station, David was processed and led to a holding cell. The door clanged shut behind him, the sound echoing finality. He sank onto the hard bench, his mind racing. Hours passed. David dozed fitfully, memories of his past life mingling with the harsh reality of his present. The cell door creaked open, jolting him awake. Reed stood in the doorway, his face a mask of professional detachment. "You've got a visitor." David's heart leapt, hope surging through him. But as he was led to the visitation room, his spirits fell. It wasn't Sarah or Emily waiting for him, but Mayor Thompson. Thompson's smile was cold as David sat across from him. "You've caused quite a stir, Walker." David met his gaze steadily. "Just telling the truth, Richard. Something you might want to try sometime." Thompson's smile faltered. "The truth? You mean your lies about being Emily's father? About your innocence?" He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. "We both know what really happened that night." David's fists clenched under the table. "You framed me, destroyed my life. For what? Your political ambitions." "You have no proof," Thompson hissed. "And even if you did, who would believe a homeless man over the mayor? You're nothing, David. You always were." As Thompson stood to leave, David called out, "The truth always comes out, Richard, one way or another." Thompson paused at the door, his face twisting with contempt. "We'll see about that." After Thompson left, David was returned to his cell. He paced restlessly, his mind churning with possibilities and fears. What if Thompson was right? What if no one believed him? Meanwhile, across town, Detective Reed sat at his desk, staring at the old case files he'd pulled from the archives. David's words echoed in his mind, urging him to look deeper. As Reed flipped through the pages, something caught his eye. A discrepancy in the timeline, a witness statement that didn't quite add up. He frowned, digging deeper. Hours passed as Reed pored over the files, piecing together a puzzle he hadn't even known existed. The more he uncovered, the more his unease grew. A knock at his office door startled him. "Come in," he called, hastily covering the files. Officer Johnson, a fresh-faced rookie, poked his head in. "Package for you, detective. Just arrived." Reed nodded his thanks, taking the small envelope. As soon as Johnson left, he tore it open. Inside was a single sheet of paper, yellowed with age. Reed's eyes widened as he read its contents. It was a letter, dated just days before David's disappearance years ago. In it, David detailed his suspicions about Thompson's illegal activities, his plans to expose the truth. The letter was addressed to the police chief, at the time, Reed's predecessor. Reed's mind raced. This letter had never been part of the official investigation. It had been buried, hidden away. But by whom? And why had it surfaced now? As the implications sank in, Reed knew he couldn't ignore this. He had to dig deeper, no matter the consequences. Across town, Sarah Thompson sat in her living room, her daughter's words replaying in her mind. Could it really be true? Could David really be alive? She pulled out an old photo album hidden away in the back of her closet. As she flipped through the pages, memories flooded back. David's smile, the warmth of his embrace, the love in his eyes as he held their newborn daughter. Sarah's fingers traced the outline of David's face in a faded photograph. How had it all gone so wrong? The accusations, the trial, his disappearance. It had all happened so fast. A tear splashed onto the page. Sarah wiped it away, her resolve hardening. She needed answers, and she knew just where to start. Back at the police station, David lay on his cot, staring at the ceiling. The sound of footsteps approaching made him sit up. Reed appeared at the cell door, his face grim. "We need to talk, Walker." David was led to an interrogation room, his heart pounding. Was this it? Had Reed found something? Reed sat across from him, his expression unreadable. "I've been looking into your case," he began, "and I've found some inconsistencies." David leaned forward, hope blooming in his chest. "What kind of inconsistencies?" Reed hesitated, then pushed a folder across the table. Evidence that was never presented at your trial. Witness statements that were altered. And this. He pulled out the letter David had written years ago. David's breath caught in his throat as he recognized his own handwriting. "Where did you get this?" he whispered. "It was delivered to me anonymously," Reed replied. "David, if what's in this letter is true—" "It is," David said firmly. "Every word of it. Thompson's been corrupt from the start. He framed me to cover his tracks." Reed ran a hand over his face, the weight of this revelation settling on his shoulders. "This changes everything. But we need more than just this letter to prove it." David nodded, a fierce determination in his eyes. "I've spent years gathering evidence, Marcus. It's hidden, scattered across the city. If we can piece it all together, we can bring Thompson down," Reed finished. As they began to plan their next move, neither man noticed the small red light blinking in the corner of the room. In his office, Mayor Thompson leaned back in his chair, a cruel smile playing on his lips as he listened to their conversation. "So the game is on," he murmured, reaching for his phone. "Time to call in some favors." Across town, in a dimly lit parking garage, a figure emerged from the shadows. Reed tensed, his hand instinctively moving to his holster. "Detective Reed," a gravelly voice called out. "I hear you've been asking questions about the mayor." Reed squinted into the darkness. "Who's there? Show yourself." A man stepped into the light, his face hidden beneath a hood. "Let's just say I'm a friend, and I'm here to warn you. Drop this investigation, for your own good." Reed stood his ground. "Is that a threat?" The man chuckled darkly. "Consider it friendly advice. Thompson has powerful friends. You don't want to make enemies of them." Before Reed could respond, the man melted back into the shadows. The encounter left Reed shaken, but more determined than ever. As he drove home that night, his mind racing with all he'd learned, Reed failed to notice the car tailing him. It followed at a distance, its occupants watching his every move. The next morning, as Reed arrived at the station, he found a note on his desk. The message was simple, but chilling. "Back off, or else." Reed crumpled the note in his fist, his jaw set. He knew the risks, but he couldn't turn back now. Not when he was so close to uncovering the truth. Little did he know, his investigation was about to uncover a conspiracy far larger and more dangerous than he could have ever imagined. And at the center of it all was David Walker, a man who had lost everything but was now on the verge of reclaiming his life, if he could survive long enough to see justice served. Detective Reed's fingers trembled as he dialed Sarah Thompson's number. Each ring felt like an eternity, the weight of his discovery pressing down on him. "Hello." Sarah's voice was cautious. Reed took a deep breath. "Mrs. Thompson, it's Detective Reed. We need to talk. It's about David and your husband." Silence hung heavy on the line. Then, "Meet me at Riverside Park in an hour." As Reed hung up, a shadow fell across his desk. He looked up to find Captain Briggs looming over him, eyes narrowed. "Reed, my office. Now." The walk to Briggs' office felt like a march to the gallows. Reed's mind raced, wondering how much the captain knew. Briggs shut the door with a soft click. "I hear you've been digging into old cases involving the mayor." Reed straightened his spine. "Just following up on some new leads, sir." Briggs' laugh was humorless. "Cut the crap, Reed. You're treading dangerous waters. The mayor's got friends in high places. One word from him, and your career is over." "Are you threatening me, sir?" "I'm warning you," Briggs growled. "Drop it. That's an order." Reed's jaw clenched. "And if I don't?" Briggs' eyes hardened. "Then you're on your own." As Reed left the station, he felt eyes on him from every direction. Colleagues who once greeted him warmly now averted their gaze. The weight of isolation settled on his shoulders. At Riverside Park, Sarah Thompson paced nervously, her elegant clothes a stark contrast to the shabby surroundings. When she saw Reed approach, her eyes widened with a mix of hope and fear. "What's this about David?" she demanded. Reed glanced around, ensuring they were alone. Mrs. Thompson, I have reason to believe your husband framed David Walker all those years ago. The accident, the disappearance. It was all orchestrated by Mayor Thompson. Sarah's face drained of color. No, that's impossible. Richard wouldn't. I have evidence. Reed pressed on. Documents, witness statements that were buried. Your husband has been lying to you, to everyone for years. Sarah's world tilted on its axis. Memories flooded back. Richard's sudden rise to power, his insistence on her cutting ties with David's family, the unexplained wealth. It all made a horrifying kind of sense. Oh God, she whispered. Emily, she was right about David being her father. What have I done? Reed placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. It's not too late to make things right, but we need your help. Across town, in a dimly lit cell, David Walker stared at the ceiling, his mind a whirlwind of memories and regrets. The sound of approaching footsteps made him sit up. A guard appeared, his face impassive. Walker, you've got a visitor. David's heart leapt, hoping to see Reed or Sarah. Instead, he found himself face to face with Mayor Richard Thompson. Thompson's smile was cold. Hello, David. Comfortable? David met his gaze steadily. What do you want, Richard? Thompson's facade cracked, revealing a flicker of desperation. I want you to disappear again, for good this time. And why would I do that? Thompson leaned in, his voice low and menacing. Because if you don't, I'll make sure Emily pays the price for your stubbornness. David's blood ran cold. You wouldn't dare touch your own daughter. She's not my daughter, is she? Thompson sneered. She's just a reminder of my wife's betrayal. So what'll it be, David? Your freedom or Emily's safety? Before David could respond, a commotion erupted outside the cell. Sarah burst in, her eyes blazing with fury. You bastard, she screamed at Thompson. How could you? All these years, you've been lying to me, to everyone. Thompson's face paled. Sarah, I can explain. Save it, she spat. I know everything. Detective Reed showed me the evidence. It's over, Richard. As if on cue, Reed appeared behind Sarah, flanked by two officers. Mayor Richard Thompson, you're under arrest for fraud, corruption, and obstruction of justice. Thompson's eyes darted wildly between Sarah, David, and Reed. In a desperate move, he lunged for Sarah, grabbing her arm. You can't do this to me, he snarled. I made you who you are. David moved with a speed that belied his years on the streets. He tackled Thompson, pinning him against the wall. Don't you ever touch her again, David growled, his voice low and dangerous. As the officers pulled Thompson away, the mayor's mask of civility crumbled completely. You'll regret this, he shouted. All of you. I have friends in high places. This isn't over. In the chaos that followed, David found himself free of his cell, standing beside Sarah. Their eyes met, years of pain and longing passing between them in a single glance. I'm so sorry, David, Sarah whispered, tears streaming down her face. I should have believed in you. David's hand found hers, squeezing gently. We both made mistakes. What matters is where we go from here. As they left the station, a crowd had gathered outside. News of the mayor's arrest had spread like wildfire. Cameras flashed, reporters shouted questions, but David and Sarah pushed through, Reed clearing a path for them. They found Emily waiting at the edge of the crowd, her small face a mix of confusion and hope. When she saw David, her eyes lit up. Daddy, she cried, running towards him. David knelt down, opening his arms. As Emily crashed into him, he felt years of pain and loneliness melt away. He looked up at Sarah, saw the love and regret in her eyes, and knew that somehow they would find a way forward. But their moment of peace was short-lived. A black SUV screeched to a halt nearby, and men in suits emerged, their faces grim. David Walker, one of them called out, we need you to come with us. Reed stepped forward, badge in hand. On whose authority? The man flashed a badge of his own. Federal Bureau of Investigation. Mr. Walker's testimony is crucial to an ongoing investigation into corruption at the highest levels of city government. David's heart sank. He looked at Sarah and Emily, saw the fear in their eyes. "I have to go," he said softly, "but I promise I'll come back. We'll be a family again." As David was led away, the crowd's murmurs grew louder. Some shouted encouragement, others hurled insults. The divide was clear: those who saw a man wronged by the system, and those who still saw a criminal. Reed watched the scene unfold, his detective's mind piecing together the larger picture. This wasn't just about David or Thompson. It was about a system that allowed the powerful to prey on the vulnerable, that turned a blind eye to injustice as long as it wore a suit and tie. As the SUV pulled away, Reed made a silent vow. He would see this through, no matter the cost. For David, for Emily, for every person who had ever been crushed under the weight of corruption and prejudice. The battle was far from over, but for the first time in years, hope glimmered on the horizon. A hope that justice, true justice, might finally prevail. The courtroom buzzed with tension as David Walker took the stand. His once ragged appearance had been replaced by a clean-shaven face and a modest suit, but his eyes still held the weight of years spent on the streets. "Mr. Walker," the prosecutor began, her voice sharp, "can you tell us about the night of September 15th, 7 years ago?" David's gaze swept across the courtroom, landing briefly on Sarah and Emily in the front row before settling on Richard Thompson's scowling face. "That was the night Richard Thompson framed me for embezzlement," David said, his voice steady. "The night he stole my life." A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom. Richard's face contorted with rage, but his lawyer's hand on his arm kept him seated. As David recounted the events of that fateful night, the courtroom hung on his every word. He spoke of discovering irregularities in the city's financial records, of confronting Richard, and of a staged accident that led to his disappearance. "I woke up in a hospital 2 states over," David continued, his voice thick with emotion. "My ID was gone, my accounts emptied. I had nothing but the clothes on my back and a head injury that left me disoriented for months." Sarah's quiet sobs echoed in the hushed courtroom. Emily, her young face a mask of determination, gripped her mother's hand tightly. The prosecutor nodded sympathetically. "And what happened then, Mr. Walker?" David's eyes hardened. "I survived. I gathered evidence. And I waited for the right moment to reclaim my life and my family." As the trial progressed, a parade of witnesses took the stand. Detective Reed presented the evidence he'd uncovered, his testimony damning Richard Thompson and his co-conspirators. Former city officials, intimidated into silence for years, finally spoke out about the corruption they'd witnessed. But was Sarah's testimony that truly turned the tide. "I believe the lies," she said, her voice trembling. "Richard told me David had stolen from the city, that he'd abandoned us. I was hurt and angry, and I let those feelings blind me to the truth." She turned to face David, tears streaming down her face. "I'm so sorry, David. Can you ever forgive me?" David's eyes glistened as he nodded, a small smile tugging at his lips. As the trial neared its end, Richard Thompson's lawyer made a last-ditch effort to discredit David. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he began, his voice oily smooth, "Mr. Walker will have you believe he's a victim. But let's consider the facts. He disappeared for 7 years, leaving his wife and child behind. He lived as a vagrant, a drain on society. And now he expects us to believe he's some kind of hero." Murmurs rippled through the courtroom. David felt a familiar weight settling in his chest, the fear that once again he would be judged by his circumstances rather than his character. But then, a small voice piped up from the gallery. "That's not true." All eyes turned to Emily, who had jumped to her feet, her face flushed with indignation. "Emily, sit down," Sarah whispered urgently, trying to pull her daughter back into her seat. But Emily shook off her mother's hand, her eyes blazing. "No, I won't let them lie about my dad. He saved me, even when he didn't know who I was. He's kind and brave, and he never stopped loving us, even when the whole world turned against him." The courtroom fell silent, Emily's words hanging in the air. The judge, after a moment's hesitation, allowed her to continue. "My dad taught me that it's not what you have that matters, it's what you do," Emily said, her voice growing stronger. "He had nothing, but he still helped people. He still fought for what was right. That's what a real hero does." As Emily finished speaking, a slow applause began to build. The judge quickly called for order, but the damage to Richard's case was done. In the end, the jury's deliberation was brief. Richard Thompson and his co-conspirators were found guilty on all counts. As the verdicts were read, David felt a weight lift from his shoulders, years of pain and injustice finally finding resolution. Outside the courthouse, a crowd had gathered. Reporters jostled for position, cameras flashed, and curious onlookers craned their necks to catch a glimpse of the man who had brought down the corrupt mayor. As David emerged, flanked by Sarah and Emily, a hush fell over the crowd. For a moment, he was transported back to that day in the alley, feeling the weight of judgment and suspicion. But then, someone started clapping. The applause spread, growing into a thunderous ovation. Signs appeared in the crowd. "Justice for David Walker. Heroes come in all forms. Integrity wins." David felt overwhelmed, tears pricking at his eyes. He looked down at Emily, who beamed up at him with pride. "You did it, Dad," she said, squeezing his hand. Sarah leaned in, her voice soft. "We did it. Together." As they made their way through the crowd, David caught sight of Detective Reed, who gave him a respectful nod. Nearby, he saw familiar faces from his years on the street. The kind shopkeeper who sometimes slipped him extra food, the librarian who never kicked him out on cold days, the nurse who treated his injuries without question. These small acts of kindness, these moments of human decency, had kept him going through the darkest times. They had reminded him that goodness still existed in the world, even when it seemed hidden. Reaching the edge of the crowd, David paused. He turned to face the sea of cameras and curious faces, feeling the weight of this moment. "For years, I was judged by my appearance, by my circumstances," he began, his voice carrying across the hushed crowd. "But today, we've seen that the truth can't stay buried forever, that justice can prevail even against the most powerful opponents." He looked at Sarah and Emily, drawing strength from their presence. "I stand here not just as a man exonerated, but as a testament to the power of perseverance, of never giving up hope, and more importantly, as a reminder that we should judge people not by their clothes or their status, but by their actions and their character." The crowd erupted in cheers, but David raised his hand, not finished. "This victory isn't just mine. It belongs to every person who showed kindness to a stranger, who stood up for what's right even when it was difficult, who refused to let injustice go unchallenged. Today, we've proven that together we can make a difference. We can change the world, one small act of courage at a time." As David finished speaking, the applause was deafening. Reporters shouted questions, but David simply smiled, pulling Sarah and Emily close. "Let's go home," he said softly. As they walked away, David knew that the road ahead wouldn't be easy. There were wounds to heal, trust to rebuild, and a life to reclaim. But for the first time in years, he felt hope, not just for himself, but for a world where justice could triumph over corruption, where kindness could overcome prejudice, and where a man could be judged not by his circumstances, but by the content of his character. In that moment, David Walker, once a successful businessman, then a homeless man, now a symbol of resilience and justice, knew that his greatest journey was just beginning. And this time, he wouldn't be walking it alone.